Anger. That emotion is so pervasive, and we all have feelings about it, our own and others. When we experience it in others, it often makes us uncomfortable. When we are angry, we feel justified in our anger. It's interesting to observe Jesus' actions and his response to the religious leaders who call him to account. Why is he so upset about the selling of animals for sacrifices and doing it in the temple courts? Wouldn't we choose different issues over which to become this agitated? Like Roman oppression, or the fraudulent practices of tax collectors, the obsessive adherence to rules enforced by the religious community, dictating every part of every Hebrew's life every day, to name just a few. Before we go any further, we need to understand the significance of the temple with a capital T. In fact, at the dedication of the first temple, King Solomon kneels down and prays a heartfelt and all-encompassing prayer of blessing over the temple and over the people of God who were gathered there. When King Solomon then rises to his feet again, a thick cloud covers him and fills the temple, which he recognizes as the presence of God. This is the holy place. That is the place of worship and blessing that was destroyed by the Babylonians when they invaded and conquered the Hebrew community, dragging most of its population into exile. And here's where it gets really interesting. Reverend Jason McKelly, pastor of the Annandale United Methodist Church, writes, after 70 years in captivity, King Cyrus of Babylon let God's people go. Israel returned to the Promised Land to rebuild, with the temple being at the top of their to-do list. But according to the scripture in Ezra and Nehemiah, which the Israelites completed construction of the second temple, which took 46 years. Those who could remember the original temple, the first temple, wept and mourned. For this new temple, this second temple, did not have the Ark of the Covenant in it. And therefore there was no dwelling place for the Spirit of God. The glory of God was not in it. Israel had returned and rebuilt the temple, but God had not returned to it. The temple had meaning for the people Jesus encountered that fateful day of whips and coins flying and scrambling animals. So I wonder which meaning of temple people understood. Primarily, the temple would be understood as a place where God dwells. Every Hebrew would have heard these words repeatedly, recognizing the significance of the divine living among them. Of course, there were no people alive during Jesus' day who were living when this dramatic presence of God filled the temple, the first temple, at its dedication and blessing. Once actual experience with God is exchanged for stories about God, everything changes. And the metaphor begins to become tangled. After the departure of the presence of God, the temple moves into its secondary meaning, an edifice in which to conduct religious rituals. The second temple was magnificent, just as the first one had been, but there were key elements that were missing. One could argue that over many, many years, with the Hebrew people having been in different places, having experienced personal and spiritual trauma at the hands of their captors, their religious experience changed enough that the second temple could never be what the first temple had been. That may be. However, the presence of the divine could never be replaced with anything else. This is not to say that there was no significance in that ritual. There was. But the important things, some of the most important elements, were missing. And Jewish scholars will tell us this. And the metaphor further tangles. Without a place where the Holy One resides, the second temple needed to take on a very, very different function. In the first temple, there had been a specific place where the Ark of the Covenant, which was basically a furniture piece, was placed in the Holy of Holies, a place separated by thick, elaborate curtains, and that is where the presence of God was said to reside. So that was not present in this second temple, which demanded the buying and the selling of animals, and that, in and of itself, became completely transactional. The temple was then reduced to an edifice which was there to monetize religion, and that opens up all kinds of abusive appropriation. And the mess continues and deepens, and the metaphor gets more and more tangled. United Church of Christ Sermon Seeds writer and editor Cheryl Lindsay notes the difference between transactions and transactionalism. Transactions, she says, can be neutral. The exchanges of ideas and goods and services can benefit those who give and receive. As relational beings, much of our lives involve transactions, exchanges, and interactions between humans. Transactions are a means to an end, but transactionalism occurs when the means becomes the end. Simply stated, what was happening at the temple that Jesus entered that day, the buying and the selling of the animals to be used for sacrifice, was no longer just a transaction designed to be a means towards an end, but it had become transactional, which means that the means had become the end itself. Religion had been monetized, resulting in the oppression of people who needed to pay the inflated prices set by the sellers in order to have offerings they needed to buy their own forgiveness. The indulgences sold by the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages were not the first, nor the last example of transactionalism. This abusive appropriation is what Jesus was attacking that day in the temple. And now the metaphor takes on another new twist, a very, very interesting tangle. This is where Jesus introduces himself as a temple, lowercase t. When the temple authorities intervene, asking Jesus to justify his angry outburst, he makes a surprising comment. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. Lowercase t for temple. The retort that this is essentially impossible because it took 46 years to construct this temple, uppercase T. Jesus was using a metaphor. The temple authorities were thinking in literal terms. A transactional temple protocol is all that they knew. Their livelihood was wrapped up in it. Their power over people was tied to it. Their belief that they were somehow connected with the divine because they were linked to these rituals occurring in and around this edifice was evident. Rather than taking the time to ask Jesus what he meant, they work off of their own assumption and essentially labeled Jesus as irrational, maybe even delusional. But there's a fourth meaning of the temple, and that one is redemptive. Jesus describes his own body as housing divine presence. What had previously been observed only in the temporary and transient structure called the tabernacle, or then later in the magnificence of the fixed and stable first temple, was now accessible as personal, physical, and utterly inclusive. Jesus declares there is another place in which the divine makes their dwelling, in his body, and therefore in all bodies that create a welcome and humble and transformation-desiring space. Now that's a tangle none of us would have ever anticipated, but it changes everything. Why is Jesus so upset about the selling of animals for sacrifice and doing it in the temple courts? Well, his anger is in response to the deeper reality that the presence of God is nowhere visible in what was meant to be the house of God. Once we understand this, everything shifts. With this dramatic shift, we can exchange old patterns for new possibilities. We no longer need to see Jesus' anger as the central piece to this story. Shifting our approach then strips us of our tendency to reference this story to justify our own righteous anger. We're offered an alternative to reading a story like this at face value, choosing rather to understand the context and the history instead of creating our own dogma. This can be an important check and balance in assessing how far we are down the slippery slope of monetizing religion. We can take the worn-out beliefs that an edifice, rituals and practices, even abusive requirements are inevitable, and exchange those beliefs for a new possibility of divine presence being the primary element, the driving force, and the requirement for what we do. And this presence is not limited to the temple or to any edifice or structure. It can be found in human bodies, in nature, in gathered community, anywhere and everywhere. When Jesus spoke of his body as a temple, a place for the divine to dwell, this introduces a metaphor that will mess with our preconceived ideas and will remain tangled until we let go. Let go of what we think should be and invite divine presence. In case this all sounds very theoretical and theological, it really isn't. Think about how this informs how we move forward with our mixed-use project. If the presence of the divine doesn't in some way inspire and inhabit the space we envision and create, it will be just another building project. How will we go about inviting and preparing for divine presence for an entire project? If we think of sanctuary only in a certain shape, with predetermined elements, without being deeply thoughtful about how we encounter God in the 21st century, we will become irrelevant. What is a sanctuary, and what function does it have today? If our homes, the place in which we experience the most human things like preparing food and sleeping at night and laughing with our loved ones and even conflict, if these aren't considered sanctuaries, we exclude the divine from our intimate spaces. How can we open our homes to become sanctuaries for the divine? If we think what is spiritual happens only in church on Sunday mornings using the right formulas and formats, we have condensed spirituality to a cold shell. Besides a typical worship experience on Sunday or other long-held tradition, what could awaken our awareness of the divine? If we fail to recognize the importance of each of our physical bodies, we are left with an intellectual, debatable set of doctrines. And this falls far short of being a space where the presence of God dwells. Could it be that this also includes the disembodied practice of having many activities and gatherings taking place online? We are made for physical, in-person connection. Jesus' tangled metaphor, speaking of his body as a temple, has created all of this holy upheaval. It leaves absolutely no stone unturned, so to speak. Are we prepared for divine presence? Do we seek it? Are we ready to become curious about what we can learn about Jesus and through Scripture, rather than assuming face value meaning? Can we question our own ruts and practices that we have come to see as being necessary? I invite you to take some time to think about that. Talk about it with each other. Discuss it in groups. As Maya Angelou has said, when you know better, you do better. May it be so.